Welcome to part two. So with all the modelling done in Modular, it's time to just export all the assets. And from the export dialog here, so this is sort of there's a new system currently in development, excuse me, within the export settings, where you define these assets over here, and then they'll have a path, project path associated with them, and you'll be saving out from here. So it has export full scene there, and in this version I think export selected was removed. I usually just use, I'm not really using this because I've been testing it alright in the beta, but it's not really fully ready yet to use, so I'm just waiting for that to be ready. But I've been testing it out, and in this particular version I'm using here, export selected has been removed, but it's going to be added back in. So I just find that handiest to use at the moment, or that's what I've always really used before they added in this, so I know exactly what because you can just export groups and then they will be separate objects in Blender or wherever, Maya, wherever you're going, and you can organize them in there or just organize them here. It's really a matter of workflow, whatever you prefer to do. So the main thing, I suppose, is to, what do you want to be separate objects and what do you want to be merged together. You can boolean stuff together obviously in Blender to create a solid manifold mesh, or if you want parts, like I didn't do it in this project, but for instance if I want to open these doors, I'm obviously going to keep them separate, put the pivot on the hinges, and then if you want to have functionality with blueprints in Unreal then to open the doors or whatever. So while it's not essential to do all this here at this stage because you can do it later on in Modular, it's good to have an idea of what what exactly you want to be part of, what the asset's going to do. Is it going to have functionality? Do you want to save on geometry and UVs by merging things together, so that in voxels here they're going to obviously merge into a solid mesh, so backsides geometry will all be obviously stitched together, and then you won't have UV space, all the rest of it, but as I explained in the last video, the UV space doesn't really matter for the backsides of things that will never be seen. You just shrink them down on the UV sheet. So yeah, so that's the way I do it, and I kind of eyeball it as well, so it can be a back and forth process. You can iterate easily, so it's not just to do it once and that's it. Then you can always just come back and keep re-exporting to suit until you have everything together and assembled in your 3D package, Blender, Maya, whatever. So my settings here, they're fairly straightforward. FBX, the scale I don't mind too much because I know I have him in the scene from the start, so I'll be scaling everything to exact scale within Blender. I don't even worry about it in here. Set up. None of this, you can set this to more or less any of these, it doesn't really matter. Same with this, if you're going to be rescaling in your 3D program, triangles, and then this is in this beta as well, count the percent. I usually use percent, so I usually aim for, these are, as I said, are all going to be nanite meshes, and I usually aim for around 3, 4, 5% depending on what the poly count is going to be and depending on each piece. And in that way as well, even though with nanite they say, oh yeah, you can just put loads of meshes with millions of polys and everything, you still want to keep things optimized. You don't want to just throw willy-nilly. You only need as much as you need, as simple as it sounds. So that's what I was saying, it's a trial and error thing. I might export something here excuse me, at 5% say, and it might be more than I need, so I'll come back and then just lower it down, and then you get an idea. Enough times you do it, you get an idea, and you can come in here and get an idea as well. If it looks too crunchy when you zoom in, then I'll res up. And there's a nice feature now in Modular that exports weighted normals. Does a really good job on the decimated mesh, and I did it with a few assets. I was using Blender's decimate modifier to further take the poly count down, and then adding weighted normals to regain those normals, because obviously they break when you decimate outside of here. and it didn't work for some, it worked for others, so depends. It was on a per asset basis as well. So and with the poly count then I'm always using a global adaptivity. It's quite an in-depth subject. I was chatting with David, the guy that developed it, and basically the bottom line is you can keep it on for most cases, and for hard surface stuff like this, where I want to push the details out to the curvature and the corners and the detail, I will usually set it higher. I tried different settings here, between 40 and 75. 75 is too high, 40 was too low, so I found 65 worked out well for these assets. And that's pretty much it. Not using any of this stuff. Flatten the hierarchy. I'm not using instances, or these are all self-explanatory. Positive transforms only if you've mirrored anything and you export it. This will just bake in the scale. So they're the settings I use pretty much. And then, as I said, it's just a back and forth iterative trial and error that you get used to. And that's pretty much it. So Blender next. So once I've imported everything into Blender and set the scale, I have the UE. Is he here? Not in the scene, but I would have had him in the scene. This was all done 3 weeks ago. So this scene is constantly coming back and forth to this. So I call this here the hub scene. So that's the first scene I started on, and then I will bring parts in and out of different scenes, and then the 90-degree section has its own scene, the 4-way, the props, etc. And then you can just copy and paste between different scenes, especially when you want to match up on the grid. So I have the units here, metric, unit scale 1, set the centimeters, and then you can see what I was talking about in the last video, where because these aren't perfectly square, they're decimated voxel meshes. But it doesn't really matter if the pivot here is 0, 0, or 0, 0, and then in the center in this case, because this is going to be getting mirrored across, and then it's set up here on the grid. So I can grab this, and then with snapping on, it's going to be snapping to the grid. So I know once it's snapping here in Blender, I know it's going to snap in Unreal. And then this one is actually half on the grid, so that's 5. That's why the whole set is snapping on 5s. But you can, if you want to snap on 10s, just keep this to these grid spaces, or even it doesn't have to be 5s or 10s. You can do higher snaps in Unreal, whatever, 25, 50 even. But in my case, I like to have the finer control. So 5 is fine, because it's easy to snap those level instances together. So that's it. Then when I have all these arranged, and then I have the pivots organized. So for instance, this piece here, this piece has a mirror on it. So I only brought this in on its own without a mirror. They could have brought it in from Modular with the mirror already on it, and with the instance mirror, but with the positive transforms thing turned off. So we turn this off. That's the way it's going to work in Unreal. So if I rotate this around and turn snap on, that's exactly how it's going to work in Unreal. This piece will be dragged in from the content browser, and then the pivot, this is all set up around 0, 0, 0, 0. Same with the walls. These walls are all on top of each other. The 3 different variations of walls that are set to just easily be swapped out in Unreal, because they're exactly the same size, same pivots. And that's where the pivot is there, because this will be getting mirrored across. And the roof and the pipes and things like that, they have their pivots here centered up, but when you go into Unreal, it will automatically put the pivot down to 0, 0, 0. I have this, I've been trying this out. I didn't use it on this project, but I've been trying out this this add-on here, and you can bypass that with this include location disabled, so it'll retain the pivot. And basically what it's doing, it's enabling automatically one of the import settings on Unreal, where you can override that default behavior that sets the pivot once you import into the engine. But you have to decide then for yourself where you want to put your pivots and how it'll affect how easy it is to snap all your pieces together and duplicate them out. But because I was making level instances, I knew that I wanted to build out each of the instances around 0, 0, 0, and then you can snap them together, the level instances. And then the smaller pieces or parts like this, for instance, you can see here, I know that that's going to be dragged around in the level this as well, so that's where the pivot is. And then when you want to export, I'll show this with the props, just hit Alt G, that'll go to the center, and then it'll be, and that's the pivot is here, but you can see this is sitting right on the floor, so I've offset the pivot to match that up. And same with the floor, that'll be at 0, and then anything sitting on top, same for this, the pivot's at 0, but this is going to sit exactly where I wanted it inside Unreal. So that's the basics then with setting up pivots. And for pieces like this where the pivot is here, but on other modular kits it's very common to put the pivot in the corner here, or the corner here, whichever side, and then it'll go in here at 0, 0, 0, and then it's easy then to drag these parts out then. So imagine that the pivot's here, and you can just duplicate and then snap. And for some reason that's not on the grid. Blender, I think Blender has a weird kind of a thing with the grid where it doesn't see, it's on the grid here. And it's one over, which doesn't matter because it's covered up by the column, the truss here, but it's still on the grid. But I think Blender, in Unreal you can press Control and end, and that'll snap to the nearest grid point. Well, it's on the grid here. Yeah, it's back on it there now. So I don't know, it came from 3D Max to Blender a couple of years back, but I don't know, like Blender's grid, it's alright for the basic sort of stuff, but there's some weird stuff. You can't snap scale onto the grid, for instance, and there's a few add-ons I think that sorted out, but just for basic snapping it's gotten better since I started it, but it's still I don't know, it has this thing with this increment. You've grid and increment, but there's no absolute. It says here, where is the setting? Absolute increment snap, but I think that's incremental rather than absolute grid snap. So you can't seem to snap back onto the grid, or maybe I don't know the feature, but basically I just want to get it onto these tens. Each of these is 10 excuse me, each of these is 10 centimeters here. So once you're working within that centimeters, and try to bring it to these boxes, it doesn't matter for these here. You can see this is half on, as I said, but that's never going to be snapping. It's never going to be going this way. It's going to be going this way. And then the sections that do go that way, that attach into this part here, like the tunnels I'll show later in Unreal, like they are still matching on the 5s, so it's not essential, as I said, but probably better practice just to keep them, if you can, on these 10s, so that it's not halfway across. So when you half to piece the asset, it doesn't have a 5 as well. It's a round number in tens, if you know what I mean, in decimals. So basically that's it. Like these aren't, you kind of find your own workflow with these things. It's not hard. So you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. But the best way to find out is to build a simple kit first, just from rectangles and cubes and everything. Work it all out on the grid before you move on to something more advanced or more complex, we'll say. You can even do it within Unreal using all the primitives in there and using the grid and getting a feel for it. So here's just an example with the four-way. I was talking about it in the VR, the first part, where you want to match things up. So say for instance this part here, I would only export a quarter of this entire tile here, and then use mirrors here to see how it works together on the grid. So you can see that's just a quarter of that's got a mirror on it, and this has a mirror as well. So these are just the sections. They must have flipped across, but that would have been over here. So that's all you're exporting there, and this is just a tile from the basic kit. So you can see there, it's on the grid, it's on the grid, on the grid, on the grid. That part is over the grid, but that's the overshoot there. That doesn't matter because the wall, I know that the wall comes up to here. So they're all on the grid. This is at 0, 0, and the pivot's right here in the corner, as I mentioned there in the last bit. And pivots are all here at 0, 0, 0, so that in Unreal then it's all going to be one whole section then. And that one whole section, as I mentioned then, I've still left them as modular parts in Unreal and then built it within Unreal as a level instance. So you're not trying to unwrap one huge asset here or else combining all these into one with the level instances. That was, I suppose, the whole idea of what I was trying to do with the project, was to use them, the level instances. So this is all part of just how to plan out the kit. And as I said, if you start with a very simple idea of trying to build, just a building structure with corridors and rooms, doorways, just make it all out boxes, 2 meter square boxes and parts 1 by 2 meters, and so that it all in theory goes onto the grid and divides into itself. So say for instance you have a 1 by 1, then a 2 by 2, then a 1 by 2 and a 4 by 4 meter squared. You know that they're all going to divide into each other on the footprint of the map within the grid. Yeah, so and then I'll just use this tile, as I said, because I know that's exactly how I want, and then I'll put that on the corners here, or just these two, and make sure that it's on the grid here, on the grid here, and then it'll be fine over there and easier to work with. When you just have a quarter of it, you only have to model. And what you can do here in Blender is handy, is say for a piece like this, hang on a sec, just want to put on this extra. You can just use this proportional editing thing here. It's like a soft selection, and then when you start moving, you can do the mouse wheel to influence more or less. And in this case, like I mightn't want to stretch all these out because the bolts will get skewed. So if I needed to move this out just a bit to match up on the grid, it's easy enough to do. And because I have this small bit of overshoot here that I want, it's easy then to just move it up into position and sort of use this vertex here as a guide, get it close enough, and then you know that your pieces, when they interpenetrate in Unreal, they're going to be fine, they look fine, everything works fine, still works on the grid. So the other thing I wanted to talk about here is the unwrapping and the texel density. So usually if you're building a level, or if you're working on a game with other people, there'll be a texel resolution set up for the world, so that everything, when it gets textured, nothing looks out of place. All the textures are going to they're going to be consistent across the whole world, and all assets from you know, a giant building down to, I don't know, a table or a telephone or something, to small prop assets. Now there's tools to do this. There's an add-on textile density checker that you can use, and it'll automatically, you set whatever res, 2K, 4K, 1K, and it'll automatically match up and rescale the UVs 0 to 1 to suit that resolution, so you can maintain. But I don't like doing it that way. I prefer to just do it by eye, because, and I have this wall piece brought in here. I've already unwrapped them, and this wall was the first thing I unwrapped, and I set my textile resolution that I wanted off this. Usually there's sheets and charts out there, you know, 1 square meter in the world can be 1K, or 2 square meters can be 2K, or whatever. So you have to decide on that first. You get an idea, you know. You can use a brick wall as a good texture to use. Put the UE4 character here, standing there, create a cube 2 meters tall, put a brick texture on, scale it down till it looks right, standing beside the UE4 block. And that's, you know, a good way to do it. Bricks, because it's easy to, you know, a brick is what, about 8 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches, or thereabouts, different size bricks, but you can get a good idea. And we're walking by brick walls every day of our lives, so you get a good idea of the scale. So the way I'll do it then is, yeah, I'll settle on whatever resolution I want, and then I'll work everything else off that, but not exactly the same. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. It can be within reason. So for instance, these here, I can see like that these squares, they're pretty much matching up. And then with these, you'll see that I had space on the sheet, so I gave them extra resolution. In this case, it's probably more than double even resolution, because these are tiny in the world, and you're never going to notice the difference in textile resolution if this, and you don't, because I have already built the world and I know that for a fact. So if you have this prop here where it's going to be anyway, it doesn't look out of place. You don't say, geez, look, there's a huge texture on that and a tiny texture on that. So you just have to keep that in mind, that it doesn't. Now I wouldn't do that with 2 of these walls that were going to be beside each other, because you would notice the difference there, but you're not going to notice between this and this. And because these smaller props, like especially things like these screws, they're taking up such a tiny amount of UV space, that if you have an extra bit of space on the sheet, tiny little things like this, give them some extra room. You don't have to let the space go to waste. It's no harm to give these extra space on the sheet, even if the textile resolution is 4 times higher than this, because you're not really going to notice between a wall and the screw. But you might notice if you look at the screw and it's very low res, you'll notice that more so than if it's higher res. I think our eyes are drawn to low res things in games, especially where it starts to look a bit dodgy, especially when in a first person perspective and you're up close. So the way these are unwrapped in, you know, I'm just selecting. So say for instance, I think all of these might be on one sheet, all of these might be on a sheet, these two, these I think, and something else, or else these, and they might be on a 2K sheet then, and these will be on 4K. So try to alter the textures in higher resolution, 4K, because they can always be down-resed in the engine, rather than altering everything at 2K and then not having enough resolution. You always want to have more, and then you can res down. So say for instance this was going to be the only standalone kind of asset that wasn't getting the master material, and in this case you can see the textile resolution is way higher. And if I go over to materials here and change this out, you can see it has the 4K UV grid. If I change that to the 2K one, you know, that's more in line with the textile resolution, and that ends up getting a 2K in the game or in the level, because 4K, it's a bit much for this, and it looks decent enough with 2K. And that's pretty much it. at this stage you're deciding, because all of this stuff is relying on, except for that computer, well that's in 0 to 1 space, but all of these other assets are all going to be getting this exact same master material, same textures, same normal maps and all the rest of it. So once all this textile resolution is fairly consistent, nothing's going to look out of place between all the props and all the level sections. And also you kind of want to, you don't want to just say, alright, I'll give this for 4K, this 4K, this, because you're increasing the footprint then. The memory, especially, these days in games you hear, we have to keep this low poly, and even though you still want to optimize your meshes as much as you can, and just because I'm using nano here, I didn't throw everything in millions and millions. I optimized it and tried to keep, I also optimized the texture memory footprint by unwrapping things together on sheets so they all share the same materials, which means the material is just one draw call rather than having 5 different sets of 4K textures, 5 different materials, and then your draw call is going way up, the triangles in that case don't matter because it's the same amount of triangles, but if you're multiplying the amount of materials and texture sets you need, then that's what's going to shoot the resources up, draw calls, texture memory and all the rest of it. So triangles, keep them optimized, but not so much. It's materials and textures that are going to cost. So that's pretty much it. I used a combination here of the smart project unwrap here, so auto unwrap, but it's never going to be perfect. So I'll go in then, and if I see seams that I know for a fact are going to look bad in Unreal, I will unwrap that stuff. Or sometimes the smart project it might flatten out a section based on whatever angle threshold, but then it might just leave a load of loose triangles, so you might have to come back in and select that section and then re-unwrap that manually. Or sometimes for some of these, I manually add seams, and the way the decimator works, was this thing that was further, was not further decimated. The way the decimator works from Modular is that you can get clean sort of edges here, so it makes it that bit easier to unwrap. So it doesn't always give you those edges, but a lot of the times it will here. So not here, you'll have to work around it, but in that case I'd put the seam here along the back rather than here. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Don't just rely on auto unwrap solutions. You might have to do some manual unwrapping, but it's really easy in Blender. And also then I use this UV Packmaster, and some of these add-ons here are very handy. Which one here? That one, UV IO3. There's a couple of handy ones, but UV Packmaster is just if anyone's doing unwrapping, get UV Packmaster. It's just fantastic. I've manually packed enough texture sheets over the years that when you have to do it manually, it's just a pain, but UV Packmaster does a fantastic job. And the other thing I would say is, as I said, mentioned in the other video, all of these UVs here, they are all hidden. You can see here, here's one that was unwrapped manually, so the seam is hidden at the back, and these UVs, as I said, are going to be hidden, and they're up here. So in this case I would select all them, and I would just grab them with these other ones. I know because I've already moved all these outside, all the hidden, the likes of this here. So you can see that's up there. So I know all these that I know are going to be hidden are up here. So I'll just grab them, and then you can just bring them up to the corner. Choose a corner so you always know where they are, and and then just scale them right down and just leave them, and then it doesn't matter. You're never going to see that stuff there, and it doesn't take up any UV space, but you still have a solid mesh for lumen. And that's pretty much it then. Just go through every single asset, and you can see here when you have a lot of assets to unwrap, I usually just bring them all in here, sorry, before I just want to mention that these here, look, you can see these were further decimated in Blender and reapplied the mesh normals. Reapplied the mesh normals. The mesh normals, you have to just go around and check. Sometimes it doesn't work, so you can't do that decimation, but it worked for some of the assets, so I tried it on all of them, and the ones that didn't work I just left it. So I lay everything out here, go through them one by one, unwrap and wrap. They're all set out, so I know which materials they're going to be sharing. And then when I want to go to a UE, in this case all the pivots are going to be right here, right here at the back. So this is going to be attached to a wall, so when I snap it into the level, it's going to stick to the wall. Same for these, they're all on the back. And the likes of this here, right at the back in the middle, it's going to snap onto the wall. So, and yeah, same at the bottom here, it's going to snap to the ground, and so on. That's the way it's going to be. And then when I'm exporting to Unreal, these all have their pivots allocated, so I just hit Control G, Control S, export. I'm using this machine tools, I always use that, it's dead handy. As I said, there's this other add-on here, this one here I've used a couple of times in tests, not in this project, but I'll probably use it in the future. It's quite handy, but for the moment this is really quick, just using the hotkey, export, and that's it. Then it's quick. So I'll Alt G and then export, and then just Control S, just because I'm exporting all these from here, from this position, because I want to keep them like this, spread out in the scene in case I have to work on them, rather than have them all at 0, 0, 0 on top of each other. I'll export them to Substance Painter like this, in this position, and then when I want to go to the engine, I have two separate folders, one for Painter, one for Unreal, and then that'll go at 0, 0, 0, Control Z back. And the reason I do that is because in Painter, if you move or scale or anything, your imported file, or it's in a different position, the preserve strokes on mesh feature, when you re-import, if you change your UVs, which you can do a lot of the time, you can change your UVs, change the geometry, you have to unwrap, and you might have already done all your texture work with Painter, but it makes it easy to re-import with new UVs. But the main thing is just keep your position to make your life easier. You don't always have to do it, but I do anyway, just in case. I just have one position for Painter files, and then just a temporary position then for Unreal, so I know then it's going to be exactly where I want it with the pivot in place when I go into Unreal. And that is pretty much it for Blender, so I'll jump in and show the setup in Painter next. And I'll actually do that in part 3, because this video has gone on quite long, so I'll probably make this a 4-part, or part 3 in Painter, part 4 in Unreal. Alright then, cheers, thanks, good luck.